I would just say that in my specific case, which is probably going to be different for everybody here, my goal for specifically my movie was to do, if we want to get into specifics, to do Christian superheroes correctly. How many people remember Bible Man from the 80s? How many people saw it once and then threw it out the door as far as they could? So, in my case, I've been collecting comics basically since a very young age, and I've been a Christian I've been a Christian over 30 years, which is basically 60% of my lifetime. So, I felt the need, ever since seeing Bible Man in the 80s, that it has to be done right, or else there's no point within this subgenre of comic books and now transmedia. We have to be able to do not only a comic book, we have to make a game, we have to make a movie, we have to make a cereal box, and we have to make toys. That this subgenre needs to be done correctly. And then all of a sudden, I got a vision a year ago that I need to be that guy because nobody else is doing it. So I hope I've answered your question, but I can expand further and take up the rest of our time, but I think we need to go on.
Yeah. Well, it also kind of, I wanted to tie in, bounce off of your answer back to Sergio. It's been said that it is as important what an artist leaves out as what they include. So when you're approaching any story, but in particular a story that is based on real events, in particular the Bible, how do you make that approach? How do you personally prepare yourself to say, this is what I think is important and needs to be depicted, and this is not, and I can put it aside from my adaptation?
Yeah, I've always been a big fan of Joe Kubert. And one thing that I thought was really intriguing in his style is that he wouldn't finish the toenails or in some parts of the figure. And other instances that I saw something left out, and I asked him, Joe, why don't you finish this or that? And then he told me, well, I allowed the readers to come in and finish for me. Then I think that McLeod's book he also taps into that. And the more you draw, the more you define, the less you invite the reader in. The more you leave out, the more you allow the reader to add his 2 cents to it. And to prove the point, I remember while I was drawing something, I need a reference on a matter that I don't remember now, but when I found the reference that I knew where I remembered the object from, the reference was not complete for me to use it as reference. But when I was a kid and read that story, my mind finished that object. And in my head, I thought that it was already explained fully, even though it wasn't. That's why when you watch a movie and you see totally different than what you imagined, sometimes what you don't show is way more creative on the part of the reader because he adds to it. And then once you determine that is a good ingredient in any page, you also apply that to minimize the amount of details and information as to leave the storytelling clear and not cluttered with too much information that will deviate and focus the eye out of what is important. I remember when one inker was about to ink a few pages of mine, he got really scared when he first saw it, because he saw more than I put down in his head. Once he started inking, he realized, okay, it was not there, but because he implied in blacks, and he implied in tagging the initial of the wheel I finished in my head so quickly that I thought he threw it, but he didn't. He left it out. And that's the power of this thing is that they say that. Going back to that of believing in something, just wanted to point out Jesus of Nazareth movie. Remember that movie? I forgot the actor who played the part of Jesus, but I really think he did a great job. Yes. He says he's not a Christian, and what he did in the movie, he even make jokes and not getting really into it, but when he was doing the work, he got really into it. He really gave himself his best to portray Jesus. When he memorized the Sermon on the Mount, they had quite a few people in the crowd who did not understand English. And he spoke in English, the Sermon on the Mount. And he said that something took over the place so tremendously that he felt a presence, and a powerful presence. And the crew started crying, the crowd started crying, even not understanding the Sermon on the Mount. And he himself felt the power of the truth that he was speaking in English to an audience who did not understand the language, but the truth was there. And how was your opinion?
Can I just add that in? Scott McCloud, in Understanding Comics, talks about, what happens between the panels, that space between the panels. Literary critics, reader response critics in particular, talk about gaps in the text and how we fill gaps and intentional gaps in the text. And the biblical writers were genius at that. I mean, that's why people continue to go back, especially the Gospel of Mark. There's been so many so-called secular theorists, literary theorists, who do studies of the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospels are very laconic. They leave in these gaps, and it's intentional. It's not that, I don't feel like describing everything that's going on, but there's a reason that Mark just slowly gets to you to build after some introduction, then stops beating you over the head with, this is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But you see that nobody in the story gets it. In the Gospel of Mark, at least. The disciples all leave him, no coming back. The crowds abandon him, and we have these women, after an angel tells them what happened, they go away and tell nothing to nobody because they were afraid. And, it makes no sense from a plot, an unsolved plot, and sure enough, there's early manuscripts where people later try to fill in to get, but if you look at most of your Bibles, there's a line there, or it ends with they tell nothing to nobody. But in terms of rhetoric, in terms of inspiration, we're inspired to say, wait, he rose again. Let's go tell people. It's also interesting to see how this gets played out in retelling of the Bible in particular. I recently received a grant from the Association of Theological Schools, and I'm doing a study of children's Bibles throughout American history. And I'm really focusing on the story of Noah's Ark. And, for example, what's put in, what's left out, there's agendas even within the Jewish faith or Christian faith. For example, the Bible briefly says, Genesis briefly says, and everyone outside of the ark, everyone except for those inside the ark died. Doesn't dwell on it, but it doesn't leave that fact out. Now, in the 1800s, it was that part of the story. If you had only 2 illustrations, you were going to show little children with their parents trying to lift them up on a rock and being overcome by the waves. And the text would say, and they climbed up, and then they climbed higher, but they could not escape the wrath of God. Because that was what was important, or deemed important, for children to know that you cannot escape the wrath of God. and death is around the corner. Now, you look at children's Bibles today, not the actual Bible, but you look at children's Bibles today, and often you see Noah playing marbles with a squirrel and a raccoon, and there's no mention that anyone dies. And there's a lot in between, and there's a lot of things. Look at Genesis, says nothing about neighbors mocking him, or that other people were warned that there was a flood coming, that Noah or God warned them. But this becomes part of the story because the gap's been filled so much by people who tell the story and retell the story. And so it's an interesting thing for us to ask, and those of you who are artists or creators, why am I filling this gap this way if the Bible doesn't have it? Why am I leaving it out, or why am I elaborating that point? What's my theological